Well, hello everybody. How y'all doing? Happy Sunday. It was just late. It's almost Sunday's almost over. So, and I hope that the mosquitoes out here are horrible right now because of the rain and just the weather, the way it's been. So, um, I hope I'm not going to be uh eaten alive by them while I'm out here trying to give y'all this message. They're attacking me. Anyway, the message today is on 2 Samuel 9, and I think as I was at service this morning at Rhema, and at the Rim, and Bishop came and he was able to give us a message this morning again. So that was, again, it was nice to have him give us a word. But the thing he talked about was a favor. And the thing about that is, lately, actually for the last year, I was talking to Apostle about it. He said, look, that the Lord just gives me these signs all the time, and he's just trying to really push the idea of how the Lord provides and provision, and that's one thing with when I went on my trip, that he really showed me how that he does do that when you trust that he has everything already worked out, and that he's going to provide, not just like for you financially and things like that, but he'll provide he'll provide direction when you need it. He'll provide knowledge when you need it. He'll provide food when you need it. He will provide everything. He will provide for all your needs. So, I talk about the ravens. I see the ravens all the time because that's a sign of God's providence. And God's providence is actually, boy, these mosquitoes are so bad out here. Horrible. His providence is God in hand. Is part of. That's how the provision comes. So when you receive provision, it's evidence that God is in control, that God is the provider, that He is a provisional God, and that is actually a word that Apostle text us. I believe it was yesterday, talking about a provisional God, and so the fact that Bishop then spoke on favor this morning was a confirmation of that in a way, but it was a continuation of that because the reason God provides is because favor. When the more favor you have, the more the provision, the easier the provision comes, the more abundant the provision is. God always provides. He will provide for you. Yeah, if you're faithful and you're walking in alignment with God and you're walking in path, He's going to provide. But the more provision comes, the blessing. And I was reading the other day. I was studying. I was reading. I happened to read about Abraham and how Abraham, his faith was actually the faith that God would be a provider, that God would provide when He said He would provide the lamb or the ram for the sacrifice. He was trusting that God was going to provide, and because of his trust that God was going to be the provider, and his willingness, his willingness to sacrifice even whatever was most important to him for God, but trusting that God would provide a way out of that, a way that he wouldn't have to. make that sacrifice, that God will provide an alternative. And that's what God did, because God knew he was willing, and because God knew he was willing, he showed him favor with providing the alternative. And the end, um, he even blessed him. He blessed him beyond that. He showed him even favor beyond that. So, um, now we're into Samuel 9, and we see this theme really highlighted, and how providence and provision and favor all relates and can be wrapped up in one term, really, and that is grace. And this chapter is actually, these mosquitoes are horrible under this tree. This chapter is actually one of the most profound examples of grace, outside of, of course, Jesus, what Jesus did to show us grace. So this story of David and Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth was the last of the house of Saul, and he was Jonathan's son. And so what happens is that David decides, I guess David was probably, thinking about, at this point, Jonathan is dead, has died. Jonathan and him have they were, a covenant, that he would always honor, Jonathan. They were so close. They were knit. It says his soul was knit to Jonathan, so they were very, very close. And the covenant, this type of covenant, goes beyond death. So this is Hesed. This is everlasting, steadfast love. It goes even beyond death. So at this point, David has this idea that he's wanting to do something to honor Jonathan, and so he asked the question: Is there not anyone left of the house of Saul or of Jonathan's house that I can show a kindness to? And so this is how he's wanting to find someone he can show this kindness to. He can honor Jonathan in some way through his family, his house. And this is when they find this servant Ziba, and he tells, that is the servant of Mephibosheth, and says, that they tell him that that Jonathan has the son Mephibosheth, and that he is lame in both his feet, because remember, he was dropped by and somehow was made lame in his feet when he was from a child. So at this point, we see, usually, historically, the king, when they took over, a king would take over, and after they replaced the last dynasty of kings or whatever, they would make sure to ensure their rule and ensure their throne. They would make sure that every living descendant of the last dynasty was dead. That every member of that house that could even make any of the slightest claim to the throne, that they had to make sure that they was dead, so that they would be ensured that their throne would not be challenged. and that was a common practice that they would eliminate their potential rivals. But here we have Mephibosheth, and he is the son of Jonathan, or it's just Saul's grandson, and he's hiding in this town called Lodabar, which means a place of no pasture, and he's crippled in both feet, and he's pretty much the outcast, and he's living in fear because he doesn't know um, that David's going to be really anything like any other king at this point, and I'm sure he's had word that all that David has done killed, or that Saul has dead, Jonathan's dead, and David is taking the throne, and that there's a possibility that David's going to eliminate all his potential rivals. But so of course David sends word to have them summoned to him for them to bring Mephibosheth to him. So he's likely expecting that um, you know uh, negative um, something that he's not expecting anything good coming out of this. He's being summoned by the king, and he's likely expecting that he's going to be killed as well. But but to the surprise, when he gets there, and so when he gets there, he falls down on his face in reverence to David. Um, but surprisingly, David does not only spare Mephibosheth's life, but he actually restores all the land that was Saul's to him, and grants him a permanent seat at the royal table. Because, see, Mephibosheth he said, he felt worthless. It says um, he called himself a dead dog. He said he was just good as a dead dog. Uh, um, so, he thinks that he's worthless. He's lame. He's just worthless. He's a nothing. And in a way, thinking, uh, if he's going to be killed, why would he be killed anyway? He's no threat to David anyway. But yet, I'm just as good as a dead dog. So, you know, but David, he gives him the seat at this table and says he's going to treat him like one of his sons, one of the king's sons. And the motivation behind this was that David was driven by this covenant loyalty to Jonathan, and he honored this promise that he had made to Jonathan that he would, which was, that he would, um, there would always be this bond between his seed, between, David's seed and Jonathan's seed. So, this act of kindness that he showed to Mephibosheth was completely um, based on the relationship he had with Jonathan, not on Mephibosheth. So because of this was not a this Mephibosheth didn't do anything to earn this favor of the king. It was based on the relationship that David had with Jonathan. So it was unmerited. So, um, this act that David did, was not isolated. This act of grace, and that's what this is, an act of grace that David showed to Mephibosheth, was not isolated. If you remember, David showed Saul grace when he decided, with the restraint, when he did not um, kill him, even though Saul had hunted him and chased him through the wilderness trying to kill him. You know, um, there was two opportunities that David had that he could have killed Saul, and he did not. He didn't do it because he said he refused to stretch out his hand against the Lord's anointed. And even when he was urged to do it by his men, David, still showed mercy. So, um, this showed grace in waiting on God's timing as well, because David didn't, instead of taking this justice into his own hands, David trusted God to establish, to be the executor of justice and to establish the kingdom. And so, this parallels the gospel, is that just as David showed mercy to the man who was actually trying to destroy him, Jesus offers grace to those who are enemies of God. And David's refusal to retaliate points toward the ultimate non-retaliation of Christ on the cross, when he said, "Father, forgive them for they know not what they do." So, the key themes of this chapter is that the covenant-based love, that David's kindness is a reflection of this hesed, or steadfast, unfailing, and loyal love. It is a commitment that survives the death of the covenant partner. It also highlights grace versus merit. Mephibosheth brought nothing to the table, and he was crippled, poor, and a potential political enemy, yet he received royal favor based solely on David's initiative and the merit of his father Jonathan. And it highlights restoration of identity. Mephibosheth viewed himself as a dead dog, a term of profound unworthiness, but David's act of inviting him to the table fundamentally changed Mephibosheth's status from an outcast to a son. And this relates to the gospel and our spiritual growth, in that we are like Mephibosheth. We're spiritually broken, hiding in fear, and separated from the king due to our heritage, which is sin. We all inherited sin from Adam. And just as David reached out to Mephibosheth for Jonathan's sake, God reaches out to us for the sake of Jesus Christ. We are invited to the king's table not because we are worthy, but because we're in the Son. We abide in him. As far as spiritual growth, overcoming shame, it teaches us the lesson of overcoming shame. Our spiritual maturity is measured by our ability to accept our identity as children of the King, despite our ongoing lameness, which is our persistent weaknesses, our past. And it teaches us extending grace. Just as David reflected God's heart by seeking out the marginalized, we are called to be conduits of grace. Spiritual growth involves looking for those who feel forgotten and offering them the kindness of God. To be lights in this world, we have to have hearts like David, and we have to be like David was to Mephibosheth. David sought out to show an act of kindness to one of Saul's house because of Jonathan, to honor Jonathan. And we are supposed to seek out to show kindness to the children, to other, not just people of faith, but to all people, to honor Jesus, which is the ultimate King. So to honor our King, we should do the same act toward our fellow man that David did to Mephibosheth. As far as our reflection questions, Mephibosheth struggled to see himself as anything other than a dead dog. What labels or past failures do you still carry that prevent you from fully accepting your position at God's table? And David actively sought out Mephibosheth, who in your sphere of influence, perhaps someone marginalized, difficult, or forgotten, might need you to initiate a gesture of unexpected kindness this week. And David showed kindness for the sake of another Jonathan. In what ways does your understanding of what Jesus has done for you motivate you to show grace to others, even when it feels inconvenient or risky? As I said, this chapter reminds us that, the gospel's not about just how we get to heaven. It's about what we do right here. And it's an invitation to a table. And if we want to sit at the King's table, we have to have His favor. And we don't really do anything to earn that favor. Having a relationship, basing it on a relationship, covenantal relationship, just like how David had the covenant with Jonathan. And so, in the narration, in the tradition historically, that a table was this place of intimacy, protection, and provision. And so when the king invites the outcast to his table, when he invites any one of us to his table, the table itself becomes a sanctuary where our past shame is silenced by his present favor. His grace is something that we should live in gratitude for, because He doesn't have to give it, but He does. Just like Mephibosheth, he felt worthless, but in David's eyes, he was worth honor. We don't ever know that we may be honored because of someone else's relationship. Like, I believe through prayer, my grandmother had a relationship with the Lord, and I believe my healing came because not just so much my faith, but it was more her faith than it was mine that brought about it. That's why I believe it was an act of grace, because I don't think I did much at the point that when I was healed that I deserved it. But He did it, and so now that I realize, I have a realization of that grace that I was shown, I live in gratitude. And that is why I walk in alignment out of gratitude and reverence for the grace I was shown. And I trust that the Lord is a provider because I've seen Him provide. He provided my healing. And He's provided a lot more than that. So I trust that His word is true. And He said He'll never leave you or forsake you. So if He's provided once, He'll provide again. These mosquitoes are horrible. So, I love y'all. I'll see y'all next time.